In all the Superman conversations I've seen from normies online, I always hear All-Star Superman being mentioned as the gold standard. I also hear Red Sun, which is a very good concept and book, but I think it caught the wider audience attention due to the relative shock value of the story. What if Superman was Russian? Then there's Birthright and, of course, Kingdom Come as well. All good comics. But I feel like for the casual reader, Secret Identity will never come up in conversation because it's not as bombastic as the rest. Until I started milling around the comic book spaces online, I thought this book flew under the radar for most people. It felt like the underground band you would listen to but nobody else knew because not many people I knew were talking about it. But those who knew, really knew.
Melman says, what's your favorite Superman story and why is it Secret Identity?
That's no one's favorite story.
It is everyone's favorite story is Secret Identity, I feel like. Honestly, I'm not going to lie to you. Man, see, now I have to not say Secret Identity.
So technically this is not a Superman story. It's about Superman, but it doesn't center around Superman who was born on Krypton and raised in Smallville. It's a story that is set in Kansas where DC comic books exist and everyone knows Superman as a pop culture icon. Kal-El from Krypton is just a fictional character within the reality of this book, which attempts to approximate the real world. There is a very clever visual delineation between what is quote-unquote real world and what is in the comics. It's basically like Inception with a comic within a comic. Now, I've mentioned before how I prefer stylized art as opposed to overly realistic art, but from the first time I saw this book, I was just drawn to it for some reason. It just looked like an instant classic, like the vintage premium feel that Max Fleischer's Superman cartoon gives me. The almost photorealistic approach and the typewriter text in the caption boxes just set this book apart from everything else I was reading at the time, but in a good way. This book will age like fine wine, I thought. And after all these years, I'm happy to say I was right. It was originally told in 4 separate books which constitute 4 chapters of story, all centered around Clark Kent from Kansas and the different stages of his very eventful life. Clark didn't arrive from Krypton as far as we know, but was just a regular kid cursed with an unfortunate name. Everyone who suffered the cruelty of school understands why Clark hated his name. The constant jokes from family and friends as well as all the Superman-themed gifts got really old really fast for him. He was also wary of his lack of friends and he hated the spotlight that his name put on him. He lamented about how Clark Kent from the comics lived a pretty anonymous life with his family and friends, but he on the other hand got thrust into everyone's orbit due to a name that he did not choose. In a very clever marriage of in-story context influencing the style of the caption boxes, Clark kept a diary via his dad's old typewriter that served as narration through the whole story. The typewriter sat in an old tractor which Clark's father referred to as his fortress of solitude, something that did not bring him a lot of joy. But this was emblematic of the entire first chapter of the book, which was characterized by loneliness and introspection. Clark went out camping, which was something he regularly did as an escape from all the comparisons to Superman and the mockery that he would receive from his peers. That night, he had a dream that was a manifestation of all the pent-up frustrations he had been experiencing, and when he woke up, he was all the way up in the air. So I need to mention, I read this comic back in my late teens when I was young and hopeful and used to have frequent dreams of flying. Somewhere deep down at the back of my psyche, I wanted to be able to just wake up one day and take off into the sky. A common fantasy at that age. If I was on the fence about this book by that point, this page just spoke to me and made me feel seen. Now I was locked all the way in. The obvious question you may have if you haven't read this book is, how did this happen? Well, without spoiling too much, all I'll say is the answer is hinted at in the latter chapters but never explicitly given, which I thought was really cool. It was the least important aspect, and I'm glad the story did not devote too much time towards unearthing the mystery. With the pages that followed, there's something I started to suspect that turned out to be true. Kurt Busiek, who is the writer, wrote this book to glorify the wonder of superpowers, and Stuart Immonen as the illustrator delivered in leaps and bounds with every page. There are so many amazing and iconic pages in this book which you would have to hold in your hand to appreciate yourself. Clark did everything with these powers that I would have done if I got them. The story then goes into his school life, which I found very reminiscent of Peter Parker in Midtown High. There was a Flash Thompson stand-in bully who eventually becomes a big fan of this new hero dressed like Superman, while at the same time bullying Clark because he doesn't know that they are one and the same. It made me realize a Clark in high school comic, kinda like the earlier seasons of Smallville, would really interest me. But that call to action that launched Clark into using his superpowers for good was so organic and accompanied by really beautiful pages, something you'll hear me say over and over again. This first heroic moment, as well as the ones that were to come, were done anonymously. Clark never established a dual public persona of Superman, the hero of Earth, but did all his heroic acts as a vigilante. He ensured he went too fast for people to clearly identify him, which was a good direction for a Superman who is supposed to be in the real world. Of course, a rumor started of a boy who was performing heroic acts around Kansas, but nobody actually knew his identity. He did it well enough to where people wouldn't be completely sure that there was a superpowered being, but they would only suspect it. This was the same approach they took in Smallville, where Clark Kent's alter ego was called the Blur because people felt his impact, but nobody actually saw him.
I'm the Blur.
Bruh.
I want to leave out a lot of detail from these chapters for people who haven't read the books, because there are so many great moments I don't want to spoil. But they played a lot with concepts that are familiar in Superman's stories and subverted some of them in really great ways. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I really like stories that were set in the 80s and further back. The good old days of landline phones, newspaper cutouts, and zero social media are oddly comforting to me. I love to harken back to the simpler times of the past, so pages like this evoke a lot of positive association with my younger years. The first chapter ends with 3 interesting plot points. Clark meets a reporter who he hopes will help him discover the origins of his powers, and this becomes a big plot point for the conclusion of his early years. You think you know where it's going because of Lois Lane, but you really don't. He also gets on the government's radar, which essentially closes out the first chapter and was relevant until the end of the story. And he finally embraces the Clark Kent Superman joke. He dons one of the costumes that was gifted to him by his uncle, which finally introduces a red and blue Superman into the story. The suit came with a much bigger crisis than I would have expected with the low-key nature of the story up until that point, and I was actually shocked by the conclusion. If Chapter 1 was about isolation and self-discovery, Chapter 2 was about growth and companionship. It opens as the first chapter did with a scene from a comic that will be a relevant part of this chapter. Clark is now in Manhattan working in print media for The New Yorker. For someone who didn't like being compared to Superman, he really followed the template to the letter. But Chapter 1 had already established that he enjoyed writing, so as similar as he was to Superman, it was a natural progression from the previous events. He is mature here with more experience in heroism, but the government is still on his tail. He still works like a ghost who disappears once the good deed is done, and this keeps his secret safe. He experiences a career pivot into authoring books and gets to meet a nice young lady called Lois. This particular aspect of the story really highlighted the strengths of the writer. It was an extremely natural meeting that came from mutual friends trying to troll them because of their names, Lois and Clark. I really loved how things developed between them and what Lois introduced to his life. But wouldn't you know it, when everything was going well, the other shoe had to drop. While out on patrol, he spotted a boat in distress and sprung into action. And did I mention how beautiful these pages are? So it turned out the boat crisis was a government trap, and they hit him with everything they had until he went down. His worst fears came true when the government caught him and turned him into a lab rat. He was heavily sedated as the strange men ran tests on him, but after a while he started to come to. I loved the random comic book references, and in this case, hallucinations involving Superman comics that paralleled his situation. This sequence of pages was as invasive and uncomfortable as you would imagine, but he managed to break free. There were a lot of clues here that could lead one to form opinions on why he developed superpowers, but nothing was definitive. He destroyed the facility in complete disgust on his way out, but this experience would leave him shaken for a while. In a gorgeous sequence of pages, we see the effect that the ordeal had on Clark as he retreated from the world in a state of complete paranoia and frustration. It took a toll on his relationship with Lois, and he withdrew from her as well. He adopted an even more distanced approach approach to his superheroics to ensure he was a step ahead of potential traps that the government may have tried to spring on him. He found himself desperate and isolated once more, and believed he needed to stay away from everyone he cared about for their own safety. He eventually bumped into Lois, and I love how they wrote this relationship. The easiest approach to this interaction would have involved drama, but Lois took the empathetic approach and they reconciled. Some dark things may have happened in this story, but the overall tone was very wholesome. Clark eventually decided to take the plunge, and an amazing sequence of pages followed, where he opened up to her and just decided to tell her the truth. Once again, the book basked in the wonder of how cool it would be to have superpowers like Superman, to see the world in ways that we would never get to see with our biological limitations. The chapter ended on a high, which given Clark's experiences up until that point was a great conclusion. He finally found someone that he could confide in and trust with every aspect of who he is. Chapter 3 was a testament to what the partnership with Lois did for him. You know what they say about finding a good woman. This chapter, as the in-universe comic book pages suggest, was about family. Clark became a best-selling author and was a lot more confident with his superhero rhythm. He knew how to work around the government and bypass all their traps and censors. He even enjoyed leading them on a chase just for the fun of it before he would vanish from their view. Lois is traveling a lot at this point, and when she returns home, she discloses to Clark that their family is growing, which sent Clark over the moon in a gorgeous euphoric splash page. You can really feel his joy leaping off the page. But once he settled down from his high, the worry of bringing children into a dangerous world where he was being hunted started to set in. He questioned himself, as most new fathers do, and wondered if he would be able to provide for and protect them. With a plan set on self-preservation, he chose to approach the government to strike a deal so that his family could remain safe from them, but that ended up going south very quickly. They were not there to listen and only wanted to trap him again. After his escape, he had a conversation with Lois over his fears and concerns, and her reassurance inspired him to take a more drastic approach to get the government's attention. I'll not spoil what he did, but it worked, and he finally reached an understanding with them. Clark began special operations for the government in exchange for basically being left alone. He didn't enjoy getting involved in international politics for the US government, but he was ready to do what it took to protect his family. Chapter 3 ends on another happy note after his twin daughters were born, safe and healthy. Chapter 4 opens several years later, where the twin girls are now full-grown adults. Clark receives a Santa Superman gift from them, which keeps the theme of each chapter opening with an in-universe comic book reference. This is the least eventful chapter, but it focuses on Clark's latter years. He is now 57 and his strength is waning. He is not the Superman he used to be. He can feel his powers fading, and he has to be smarter about the superheroics that he chooses to engage in. He comments that he can still see Jupiter, but he has to strain his eyes now. This whole chapter does a great job of humanizing him even more than the previous chapters. He has now been working for the government for a long time, and their attempts to find out his identity have become like a Tom and Jerry game. They almost try it out of habit, but it's not a priority anymore. He is still a myth to the public, but by this time, more super people have begun to emerge. The source of all these super people is never outright confirmed, but there's sufficient hints to satisfy the reader's curiosity. It's a much quieter chapter with some interesting reveals that I'll not spoil, but it has a great focus on family and parenting decisions. Time then jumps forward even further, and Clark is now a grandpa. His typewriter is now broken, so the caption boxes switch to a computer interface, which I thought was very clever. As much as I hate stories that remind me of my mortality and plunge me into an existential crisis, this book was the telling of a beautiful life well lived. What I will spoil is that the last page has Clark still taking to the skies even in his advanced age. He lived a full life and we got to see it all. Reading this book takes you on an entire journey with Clark where you get intimately familiar with everything about him. His joys, his fears, his anxieties and frustrations, and you will not read many comic books with this level of introspection. I feel like I was with him his whole life and he was as real as you and me. And the coolest thing is none of this happened by accident. Kurt stated that he set out to make this book about the parts of ourselves that the world never sees. All our joys and fears and concerns and insecurities laid bare on the pages of a Superman comic. comic, and Stuart Immonen was the best collaborator he could ever have had. This is one of the most gorgeous comic books you will ever read, with some of the strongest writing you'll ever see committed to a page. It's actually not just a comic, this is literature. But in closing, the story chapters were collected into a trade in 2013 and 2016 for the deluxe hardcover edition, so I highly recommend you grab that if you love good stories. Nobody is paying me to do this, but you can find a purchase link in the description box below. That's the least a responsible fan can do when recommending a book, right? Let me know your favorite Superman story in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.